Great. So welcome everyone. This is our 6th of the 6 pop-up PD sessions for the fiscal year of 2022-23. Many of you, I think, have attended other sessions. It's always great to be able to get together virtually, since we can't get together quite as easily in person. And good grief, we already have 89 people online. So here we go. Bear with me here. There we go. I would first like to say hello, bonjour, Annie, and welcome. We are gathered at many different places across the province today, and I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous people of all of the lands that we are on today. And although we're meeting virtually, we do want to acknowledge the importance of these lands that each of us calls home. We do this, each and every one of us, to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improve our own understanding of our local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we do acknowledge that the ancestral and unceded territory of all of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call these lands home. And bear with me for one more second. I'm used to using 2 screens, so today I'm kind of bouncing back and forth a bit on my one screen since I'm not at my regular location. Okay, we have a question in the chat from DLI. If someone could make, I'm guessing that's probably Jeff, a panelist. So I'm just going to pause for 1 second. And Stacy, perhaps you can do that for us.
It's done, Barb. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you, Stacy. That's wonderful. You're way ahead of me. So just in case you're new to Pop-Up PD, this is a series of presentations, webinars, PD sessions that are collectively organized each year by a group of our provincial support organizations for LBS and our regional literacy network. So we have a little committee. Most of us have been on the committee for quite some time. And COFA, our Francophone partner, is able to translate the webinars, which is wonderful. And we also really thank Deaf Literacy Initiative for providing the interpreters for these webinars. I'd like to welcome Carolyn Lazonsky and Rebecca Stuckless, who are our 2 interpreters today. And we're very glad that they're here. If you're interested in looking at any past sessions, or if, for example, there was somebody in your organization who wanted to see a pop-up PD session that wasn't able to attend, you can access previous resources at this link. If you just type into Google Pop-Up PD resources, the link will come up. And if you have any other ideas for new webinars for the coming year, then we'd always welcome your suggestions by emailing us at echannel@contactnorth.ca. And I believe Stacy just put the Pop-Up PD link in the chat. Thanks so much, Stacy, for doing that. One more little housekeeping item is that there is a quick evaluation at the end that will pop up when you exit the webinar. Stacy will also put the link in the chat a couple of times as we approach the end of the session. If you do have to leave early, we'd still really appreciate it if you would be able to fill out the evaluation. It really helps us as we plan and get ready for next year, and ways we can improve or suggestions or things that you enjoyed about today. It's a very quick evaluation. Little overview of today's session. We're going to start with a brief, and I do mean brief, review of these first 3 items. Our essential skills framework that Canada's been working under for the last 30 years or so. Secondly, a brief introduction to the new Skills for Success framework, also from the federal government, and then a very brief review of the connections between the new Skills for Success framework and our own OALCF framework. We did a webinar on this earlier in the year, and I think we might have even done one last year, just on the transition from essential skills to Skills for Success. So I don't want to spend too much time on those topics because I think many of you perhaps attended that webinar earlier in the year or the one last year. But in the event that you didn't, and in the spirit of giving everyone a similar starting point of information, then we will just, as I said, a brief review of these topics. Then we can get into the main discussion of the topics today, which is really numbers 4 and 5. And this is the ministry, our ministry's Skills for Success projects that we are involved in, some of us this year and some perhaps who will be next year. And that will incorporate some next steps. And then of course, a little wrap up at the end. I do have my chat box open. I like to try and address questions as they come up. And welcome also to Heather Robinette, who's the executive director at Quill and also chairs our Pop Up PD committee. So she's going to keep an eye on the chat as well. And Stacy from Contact North as well. But I will try, if you have questions as we go along, to address them. And if not, then Heather and Stacy can jump in and let me know that there's a question. I'd rather address them as we go along than at the end. So starting off, brief review of what's now the old Essential Skills Framework from the Government of Canada. That was originally developed in the 1980s. Many of you would be familiar with it. And back in the day, in the 80s and early 90s, when this framework was developed, it identified 9 original essential skills: reading, document use, writing, numeracy, oral communication, working with others, thinking, computer use, and continuous learning. Lots of you in our LBS world and perhaps in other areas as well have worked with the essential skills in different ways. So those have been in existence now for 25 to 30 years. Back at that time, when these essential skills and the essential skills framework were originally developed, the organization, the ministry responsible at the federal government level was Human Resources Development Canada, or HRDC. Oops, I forgot a bracket at the end. HRDC doesn't exist anymore. It's been renamed to ESDC. I'll spell out that acronym a little bit later. Along with the actual essential skills framework, there was all kinds of research and work that went into developing resources and into developing what many of you will remember as the essential skills job profiles. And so it was an enormous amount of work and a whole lot of resources tied to this essential skills framework back at that time. And of course, you would also be familiar with the National Occupation Classification, the NOC codes that went with the essential skills framework to describe different jobs and job categories in Canada. So all of that existed for a very long time. Not much of it is available any longer online. And if you've tried to search for it at all, you would have not really found much of this that's still available. One of my favorite phrases or sort of catchphrases from back at the time when I was first starting to work with essential skills programming was this one, that essential skills are the Velcro to which all other education and training sticks. And no matter what we call the skills, essential skills or skills for success or employability skills or workplace learning skills, I think this really captures the essence of what essential skills and skills for success are. That if you have strong skills in areas like reading and writing and digital and communication and so on, then any other kind of training or education that one person undertakes will be that much easier to assimilate and to move forward with. Just pausing for a sec. I don't see anything in the chat yet, so we'll move along here. So that was the very short review of the original federal government essential skills framework. Now we can talk just briefly about that quote. Okay, was from an organization called the Essential Skills Group. And way back in the, I'd say mid-90s, they coined that phrase at a conference that I was at. Currently, my organization, the CSC, is a partner with Essential Skills Group in a number of things, so they don't mind if I use their quote. And that does remind me of something else that I forgot at the beginning. And I usually forget almost every time I do one of these webinars. And that was actually to introduce myself. So I'm going to stop here for a minute, and just in case you're not acquainted with me and I'm not acquainted with you, my name is Barb Glass. I am the Executive Director of the College Sector Committee for Adult Upgrading. And that is the LBS Provincial Support Organization for the college sector. In the CSC, we have a number of other types of business that we undertake. And one of the other ones is that we are also the service provider for one of the LBS e-channel programs, the online programs. So we administer and run the ACE Distance LBS e-channel program. And I apologize, I forgot to introduce myself, but if you didn't know me already, now at least you have a little bit of a sense of who I am. So, oops, sorry. So just before we actually talk about the skills for success, I'd like to put in a little advertisement here for another webinar that's coming up. And Community Literacy of Ontario is delivering this one. And I wanted to distinguish for you the two of them in case you might be perhaps having received this invitation and interested in going to this webinar. So CLO's webinar on March 7th is going to have a look at that federal Skills for Success website, the government's website, and some of the, as it says here, the strategies and resources available on the Skills for Success website. So it's different than this webinar because we're not going to be looking at that government website today. We'll be talking about our own LBS projects. But I did want to let you know, in case you had signed up for both, what the difference was. Or if you haven't signed up for this one yet, you might want to mark that in your calendar. I don't believe the registration link has come out yet for this one. So this is more of a save the date message that I received. And many of you probably did too. So a few minutes ago, we looked at the 9 original skills for success. Now we can, sorry, the 9 original essential skills. Now we can look at the newly developed and released during the pandemic, the federal government's new Skills for Success framework. You'll see some of the skills are exactly the same as when they were called essential skills. You'll also see that some of them have a slightly different name, or in 1 or 2 cases, a completely different skill. And in 1 or 2 slides from now, I'll give you a side-by-side comparison of the old skills and the new skills in terms of what they're called. So creativity and innovation, for example, is a newly named skill. Collaboration is a newly named skill, as is adaptability. Some of these others, communication, numeracy, writing, and reading, exist in a similar format to what they did originally. So this is my only slide with the Government of Canada's Skills for Success website on it. But if you haven't seen it yet, this is the landing page for their Skills for Success website. And you can see different menus at the top where you can access different information. So this is the site that the March 7th webinar, the one that I had just showed you the save the date message for, they will be exploring this website and showing some of the resources and different pieces that are available now. And the federal government does seem to be adding to this website all the time as they build it and as they get further into the launch of the new Skills for Success framework. This was a slide from a webinar from about 1.5 years ago. And it was actually a slide that the federal government provided to us, just as a brief overview of how they see the impact of the skills for success on our changing labor market. And this was created just before COVID, just before the pandemic. But interestingly, now we're on the mostly other side of the pandemic. And fortunately, a lot of these impacts are certainly still relevant, and maybe even more so than before the pandemic, given how the labor market has changed over the last 2.5 years. So helping workers target the right skills, supporting the inclusion of vulnerable groups, facilitating the entry of individuals who are facing barriers into skilled trades, meeting the anticipated increased demand for digital skills. We all know about that. And then finally, addressing enduring gaps in foundational skills. And I feel like that's a good description of part of what we do in LBS. We know there are enduring gaps in people's skills, and we really try to help them build those and move on. A little bit later in the presentation, I'm going to refer back to this, particularly around a couple of these descriptions. One around vulnerable groups, and one around the skilled trades, and the one around digital skills. So a little bit later when I say, remember that slide on the impact of skills? This is the one I'm referring to. And this slide is the comparison one that I mentioned a minute ago, which again, you might have seen it in a previous webinar. So it just lets us see which of the original essential skills have changed and which have basically still been labeled the same way. So reading, writing, numeracy still exist in the same format, or at least with the same label. Computer use has been renamed as digital. Obviously makes sense. It's a lot more than just using computers. Thinking has been renamed to problem solving. Again, makes sense because problem solving encompasses a lot more than just thinking skills. And just going to pause to go back to the chat. Stacy, perhaps you can address Gary's question about the captioning. And Rebecca, yes, this presentation will be posted in a couple of weeks on the Pop Up PD website. And perhaps Stacy can put the Pop Up PD link back in the chat again. We'll just give her a second to do that while she's helping Gary here. So yes, absolutely, this will be available with captioning, and then soon-ish also in French. But it does take Kofa a little bit of time to do the French translation. So back to our list here, we have oral communication, which has been renamed as just communication. Again, that makes sense because it's much more than just verbal communication that is required in work and in learning and in life. Working with others has been renamed as collaboration. Continuous learning has been renamed as adaptability, which I find quite interesting. And document use no longer exists at all. That skill of document use, which is similar to our completing and creating and completing forms in the OALCF, that one has been removed from the list of the original essential skills and then embedded or worked into some of the other essential skills. So that's why document use no longer exists. And we have a new one called creativity. So there's no correlation necessarily between document use and creativity. It's just that document use is gone, embedded in other of the new skills for success, and adaptability and creativity are two new ones. So it looks like, I think that our deaf participants can now see the captioning. Thank you, Stacy, for doing that. And Heather, thank you for putting the link back in the chat again about where the recordings and the transcript and so on are located. Just going back to my chat here. Gary, I could email it to you if you can. Perhaps at the end, just put your email in the chat for me, just so I don't lose track of it, because I'm sure we'll have lots more activity in the chat. So I don't want it to get lost. Okay. Now just our last section of brief review. We're going to just quickly look at a few of the connections between Skills for Success and OALCF. And OALCF, just in case we have someone from outside of LBS here today, is the Ontario Adult Literacy Curriculum Framework. And the OALCF was modeled on that original Essential Skills Framework. It's not identical, it's not comparable, but it's similar to the Essential Skills Framework. And the OALCF is the framework that we work in our literacy and basic skills programs. And thanks, Heather, for also pointing out that the recording that's going to be posted on the website will contain the ASL interpretation. So I'm just going to go through the next 6 slides fairly quickly. What I've done here, and you might remember this if you were at the Skills for Success webinar earlier this year or last year, in the light orangey box or circle, you'll see each of our OALCF competencies. And then I've just created a few balloons, and the balloons represent the new skills for success. So I've just inserted some of the new skills for success into these slides with some connections back to our own OALCF competencies. Doesn't mean these are the only skills for success, for example, that might relate back to find and use information, but certainly there's some obvious ones like reading and writing and communication and creativity and digital. Competency B, communicate ideas and information. Again, many of the similar skills for success would be related to our competency B. Competency C is understand and use numbers, which interestingly involves almost every one of the skills for success. Use digital technology, of course, also relates to almost every one of the skills for success. I had a hard time fitting all of the balloons on this slide, actually, because there were so many links between digital technology and the new skills for success. Manage learning. Again, a number of different skills for success relate back to that. And I'm not spending too much time on these because I know some of you already are familiar with this information, but just wanted to make some of those connections back to the OALCF, since that's what we are required to work under in LBS. Now we're about 20 or 25 minutes in, and for the rest of the presentation today, we'll talk about our own LBS Skills for Success projects and how they came about and what they are. Not seeing any other questions in the chat just now, so I will keep going and provide you a little more information about what we call phase 1 of the Skills for Success projects in LBS. Last year, about a year ago, our ministry, the Ministry of Labor, and I'm going to say our because this is the ministry that funds and monitors LBS. So the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training, and Skills Development applied for funding from the federal government Skills for Success program that could be used in LBS. And the ministry met with the support organization executive directors and with some of the literacy networks at the time and told us that they had applied for this funding and were hoping to have been able to start allocating it in April of 2022. However, the provincial election came about, and during an election and the weeks leading up to an election, the government, of course, is not allowed to hand out any funding or make any announcements. So it turns out that it wasn't until several months later that our ministry here in Ontario actually got this funding from the federal government, from Employment and Social Development Canada. So that actually meant that all of the work that the ministry hoped could get done between April of 2022 and now March of 2023 had to be condensed into about 5 months. So in November or so of 2022, the ministry did make some funding available for what they're calling phase 1 of their Skills for Success project. And the phase 1 funding, which did not go to service providers, it went to the support organizations and literacy networks, and I'll explain a little more about that. But the overall Skills for Success project that our ministry has been funded for through the federal government relates to the 5 themes or buckets, as we kind of affectionately call them. And those are apprenticeship integration, Better Jobs Ontario integration, expanding and enhancing digital delivery, supporting underrepresented groups, and workplace delivery. Some of you are familiar with Better Jobs Ontario, but most of you are probably much more familiar with its predecessor, which is the Second Career Program. So anytime you now hear Better Jobs Ontario, think back to the Second Career Program. Second Career was redesigned over the last couple of years and then relaunched as Better Jobs Ontario, or BJO. So these are the themes that our ministry identified as important themes or areas related to the Skills for Success funding. They didn't consult with us as to, what we thought is the LBS field, but they had to look at what the federal funding requirements were and how they could best integrate that into funding that could then be applied to LBS. So here's where I'm going to say, remember that slide about the impacts of the Skills for Success, the slide I said, remember, I'm going to refer back to it. The reason that I am is because some of those impacts or themes in that slide are quite similar to these. They mentioned supporting people to get into skilled trades, which is, along the lines of apprenticeship integration. They mentioned enhanced digital delivery, which relates to this third theme. They certainly use the term vulnerable groups. And so here we have a theme of supporting underrepresented groups. So those are some some of the ways that our provincial Skills for Success project relates back to the broader federal government's Skills for Success priorities. So with the funding that's been available since November, the 10 provincial LBS support organizations, of which my organization is one, the CSC is one of the provincial support organizations, and all of the 16 LBS regional networks received some Skills for Success funding in November to conduct some different activities for phase one. And I'll describe those activities in a minute. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the regional LBS network in your area. And the 10 provincial LBS support organizations are, of course, related to the school board, community-based and college sector, and to our cultural streams, Francophone, Indigenous, Deaf, and we also have Laubach Literacy Ontario, we have Contact North, and we have Alpha Plus. I hope I didn't miss anyone, but all of those organizations are considered the provincial or regional LBS support organizations, and that's who the ministry came to last November and said, okay, remember back in February, we told you that we were applying for this funding. Well, now we have it, and we would like to offer you the opportunity to do some development work with the phase one funding. So of those 10 provincial support organizations, 8 of us received funding in November to develop what's very loosely called curriculum resources. And we were invited to apply under 4 of the 5 Skills for Success themes. So we could apply to develop resources under digital, under supporting apprentices, potential apprentices or current, supporting underrepresented groups, and supporting workplace delivery. I think pretty well all of the support organizations said yes, we'd like to do that. And some of you may have been involved in some of that work in terms of being hired as a developer or working as a reviewer of some of these resources. So it was a lot of work in a short time. And as a support organization ED, I would say that we're still trying very hard to get all of this work done before the end of March. Not just us in the CSC, but all of the support organizations. So in the last slide, I said 8 of the 10 support organizations got funding to do curriculum resource development. The other 2 of the 10 were invited to apply for phase one funding only under the expanding and enhancing digital delivery theme or bucket. And so Alpha Plus, many of you are familiar with Alpha Plus, as our digital and technology support organization, and Contact North were able to get some funding around the digital delivery theme. Contact North, of course, is here today because they host our Pop Up PD webinars, and they do many, many other things as well across their many locations in the province. But Contact North is also the support organization for the 5 LBS e-channel programs. And I mentioned earlier that my organization manages one of those 5 LBS e-channel programs. So we work very closely with Contact North. So Contact North and Alpha Plus got funding under digital delivery. Alpha Plus's funding was more in line with providing professional development opportunities as opposed to resources. And some of you might have attended some of Alpha Plus's PD sessions over this last few months. Contact North's funding was related to the 5 LBS e-channel programs for us to do some resource development as well. So Nancy, the bucket that didn't get funding for the support organizations was the Better Jobs Ontario integration. But as you'll see in the next slide, it did get funded for work through the regional networks. And we'll talk about the regional networks work in just a second. But just to finish up on the curriculum resource topic, for the purposes of this Skills for Success funding and the requirement to develop resources, the term curriculum resource was very broadly defined, and that was good because we had such a short timeline to get these resources developed. The ministry didn't put a lot of parameters at all around what it was we could develop. So in some cases, they might be modules, they might be short courses, they might be other types of assessments, they might be updating old resources that needed a refresher. So there's quite a big variety of things that have been developed in these last few months by the support organizations under the term curriculum resource. But again, they were all developed under one of these four. In a minute, I'll show you some examples of some of the titles of those resources that were developed. And they can be not just for LBS learners, but for our own practitioners and educators, or for other stakeholders who work closely with LBS. So it was nice actually that there was a very broad definition of curriculum resource and who it could be developed for. So believe it or not, there are actually almost 200 resources currently being developed by the provincial support organizations. As I mentioned a minute ago, you yourself perhaps, or your organization, your LBS organization might have participated in some of that development work, because we as support organizations had to very quickly go out and hire people to do this development work. The CSC, for example, was contracted to develop 27 resources. I think that Community Literacy of Ontario was contracted to develop 35. And KESBA, the school board sectoral organization, was also contracted for around 27, the same as the CSC. So, and those were only 3 of the organizations out of the 10 that were contracted to do this development work. So when all of these resources are completed, we're looking at almost 200 new ones under the 4 themes that you can see on your screen. The ministry is also working with Contact North to arrange a repository or a website, a place that we can go to access all of these new resources once they're completed. It won't be the same as the OALCF portal, where we go to retrieve the milestones and the culminating tasks. It will be a different location where these resources will be available. So let's cut to the chase. On the next few slides, I'll show you just some examples of those 200 or so resources that are being developed. First, under the apprenticeship theme. Again, some development in both language and in ASL. So I won't read through these, but I'll just leave them on the screen for a minute to show you. I tried to pick ones that showed the range of different kinds of resources from the different organizations who are developing them. And you will see, for example, this third one is an example of one that is actually for LBS educators as opposed to learners. And I think all of the rest on this screen right now are for learners, other than the third one here. So you can see quite a range just in this sample of the apprenticeship resources. There's also a range in levels. The resources go from OALCF level 1 up to OALCF level 3, depending on the organization who was developing them and their key stakeholders and the learners that most often would be associated with those with those sectors and streams. This is a sample of some of the digital resources being developed. So once again, I won't read them, but just draw your attention to a couple that are for our LBS practitioners and educators. The third one, for example, decolonizing digital delivery. And also the second last one is related to updating web links on the literacy link, sorry, the Laubach Literacy Ontario, LLO website. So again, quite a range of different topics that I've just pulled out for this sample. Just checking the time. I think we're pretty good for time. Just want to remind you again, if you do have to leave early, we'd really still appreciate it if you could complete the evaluation. It's very short, and Stacy will probably put it into the chat for the first time at about 3 o'clock in case anyone has to leave at 3. I don't think we'll be going right till 3:30, but again, very much appreciate it if you can complete the evaluation. It's quite quick, and thank you, Stacy, for putting the link in the chat again. So Catherine has a question. Will all these resources be easily accessible once they are fully developed? Yes, the ministry is arranging for them to all be posted on an easily accessible website once they are all completed. And so our colleagues at Contact North will be involved in the creation of that website and access to it. I don't know when. You know, they do all have to be finished being developed by the end of March. The ministry did say that the support organizations were quite welcome to share the resources to their respective groups even before they're posted centrally. So I expect most of us will do that. So for example, in the college sector, I'll probably make those resources available to our colleges even before the ministry's site is up and running. And other support organizations are also very welcome to do that as well. There was no need for us to wait to share them, but it will be a little while before they're all posted all together on the site that the ministry's creating or working with Contact North to create. Underrepresented groups. This is one of the bigger themes in terms of the number of resources being developed under it. So I think I might have included a couple of extras here compared to some of the other ones. At the risk of repeating myself, I'll just say again, a couple of them are directed toward educators and practitioners, most of them directed toward learners. And within this, a variety of different levels, depending on the organization who was producing it. And finally, under the workplace theme, again, just a few sample resources under that one. Some of the workplace resources, as you can see by the samples, are specific to an occupation. For example, these two, retail and material handling. There's one down here, office administration. So I would say some are related to a specific occupation or job category. Most are a little broader, as you can see by some of the other topics in this list. All right, so I don't see any other questions around anything else just now. So we'll carry on. So what we just talked about was the work of the 10 provincial LBS support organizations, the 16 regional LBS networks. It shouldn't say provincial LBS regional. It should just say the 16 LBS regional networks. So strike out the word provincial in that slide. So our 16 LBS regional networks also received funding back in November. And their work was not about creating resources. It was about creating and enhancing and discovering and building some community integration processes under the 4 themes that you see on the right-hand side. So integration to support apprenticeship, integration of LBS to support Better Jobs Ontario, previously Second Career, services for underrepresented groups, and workplace delivery. So you'll recall that the support organizations were not funded to develop Better Jobs Ontario resources because it's not really a resource category, it's more of a process and integration category. The regional networks were not funded to do anything around digital delivery because that is actually more of a resource-based theme. And I'll just take a minute and describe, not in too much detail, but just briefly what the 16 regional networks have been working on under these 4 themes. So you'll see quite a similarity in the definitions that I'm showing you on the slide here. I'm going to pause just for a second and take a drink of water. So I'll let you read that. So you can see in both of those descriptions, as I mentioned in my comments a few minutes ago, that the work of the 16 regional literacy networks is about local planning and coordination. That's already their job in the regional networks around LBS, local planning and coordination. So the ministry asked them to branch out a little bit and look in their regions and communities at possibilities for better integrating LBS supportive apprentices and better integrating LBS to support Better Jobs Ontario clients. So their work has been concrete, but not concrete in the sense of developing resources. It's been about communication, coordination, planning, developing new partnerships or enhancing existing partnerships around these themes, with the ultimate goal of being able to better integrate LBS with them. So the other 2 themes under the regional networks funding, underrepresented groups and workplace. So again, very similar definition in terms of local planning and coordination to support services for underrepresented groups. And that looks very different, of course, depending on where in the province one is located. You know, I'm from the north, and so our Mid-North Network for Adult Learning here in the north, in the Mid-North, would have a different set of underrepresented groups or different priorities for underrepresented groups than perhaps, for example, the Greater Toronto Area Literacy Network, Metro Toronto Movement for Literacy. Their collection or priorities for underrepresented groups might be quite different, but that's fine because the regional networks were asked to focus on the underrepresented groups and the needs of those groups within their own regions. So those slides described what the work was or has been and actually is continuing to be for the next 6 weeks or so around phase 1 of the Skills for Success funding that our ministry got from the federal government. Another requirement of the support organizations and the regional literacy networks was to create and participate in one or more communities of practice related to the themes of the project. And just very briefly, I've placed a definition here. Communities of practice are groups of people who share a concern or passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. So the ministry felt it was important that we establish communities of practice, and they didn't establish them for us. They just said to us, you figure it out as regional networks and support organizations, what these communities of practice will look like related to your work on the Skills for Success project. So we have we have actually 5 different communities of practice that are currently in place related to this project. And on the next slide, I'll list for you what they are. And we have been meeting monthly to discuss our work and share information and slowly try to develop the actual community of practice, because it doesn't just happen when you all of a sudden meet together. You have to, as a group of people with a shared, topic or shared passion, as the definition said, it takes some time to figure out what the community of practice looks like and what it might do. And again, given the very short timelines we're working with, we have perhaps not been able to delve as deeply into some of what a community of practice would normally do. But, they've been great meetings to share and support one another as organizations that are involved in this development work. So right now, as I mentioned, there are 5 of them. The 10 provincial LBS support organizations have one community of practice for all of the Skills for Success themes, no matter what it is we're working on. The regional literacy networks decided that they would establish a separate community of practice for each of the 4 themes that they are working on. And they each have a lead person for each of their 4 themes. For apprenticeship integration, it's the Peel, Halton, Dufferin Literacy Network. Matt Schulman is the lead for that one. For Better Jobs Ontario, it's the Adult Basic Education organization in Hamilton who's leading that one, Sarah Gill. The Underrepresented Groups Community of Practice is being led by the Rideau Ottawa Valley Literacy Network, and Lisa Ambe is their chair. There's a typo in underrepresented. Funny how one can gloss over those things no matter how many times you read it. And then finally, under workplace literacy, Literacy Link South Central has provided the lead on that community of practice, and that's Tamara Cottery. So I throw out those names because I know that there are people probably on here who are familiar with each one of those literacy networks. And to be a lead for the community of practice was strictly voluntary. It wasn't anything that was given extra funding. It was just that a few people stepped up to offer to try and lead and coordinate the community of practice for each of these organizations, or for each of these groups and themes. So for the provincial support organizations, myself and Robin Cook-Ritchie, who's the executive director of Laubach Literacy Ontario, are the leads for the community of practice for the support organizations. And we do interact together. Robin and I go to all the meetings for the regional networks, communities of practice, and those leads come to our provincial support organization, communities of practice. And then 3 times during the project, the leads all have met with the ministry because they're really interested in following the work of the communities of practice as well. And I think we have one more meeting with the ministry coming up in March before everything wraps up. We do have a website related to the Skills for Success project in the community of practice. And if things work well for me today, I'm going to put in the chat what I hope is the link to that. Oh, there it is. So the link that I just put in the chat is the link to this website. It's not an official ministry site. It's really not an official site at all. It's just what we created And specifically, Robin Cook Ritchie from Law Book Literacy Ontario offered to create this website so that we, as people working on the development in phase one, would have a place to go to post information and meeting notes and things like that. You are welcome to have a look at this site. There's nothing private on it. You can see the menu on the left has some, I keep wanting to click on it, but it's a picture, so I can't. But it does have information about the development work that's going on and some of the resource lists and so on. And we add to this all the time, just as things develop. So I would say this website will continue to exist into phase two next year as well. So now we're getting a little bit closer to probably the last quarter or so of our presentation today. And we wanted to talk a little bit about phase two of the project. We have talked for the last probably 15-20 minutes about phase one and the resource development work and the local planning and coordination work that's being funded and funded through the project and conducted by the regional literacy networks. All of that is to wrap up by March 31st. That will be the end of phase one. So let's spend the next few minutes talking about what phase two will look like. Same funding from the federal government. Our ministry got a 2-year, funding for 2 years. So phase two is the 2023-24 fiscal year, April 1st of 2023 to March 31st of 2024. So the phase two work hasn't begun yet, but this is what it will look like. I can describe it to you in the next few slides. So first of all, who could have applied for phase two funding? Well, the 10 provincial support organizations were invited to reapply for more curriculum resource development. The 16 LBS regional networks were also invited to apply for more of that local planning, coordination, integration work under the different themes. But what's different about phase two is that all LBS service providers were also invited to apply for funding. So some of you today on the line may be involved in an organization who applied for phase two funding. Some of you may not. The funding applications for the phase two work were part of the annual business planning process for LBS. And if you're someone in your organization involved in the business planning process, you will know that those business plans were due on January 27th. And the business plans happen every year in LBS. And really they are our way as service providers and support organizations of applying for next year's money. So this year, in addition to the regular kind of business plan process that we all have to undertake, the ministry also put a portion of the business plan template together where we could apply for phase two funding for the Skills for Success projects. And it was completely voluntary. Nobody was, nobody had to apply for phase two funding, whether it was for development work or for service delivery. Oops. So remember, if you think back to my description of phase one, 8 of the 10 support organizations were invited to apply under 4 of the 5 themes in phase one. This time for resource development, we were invited to apply under 3 of the 5 themes. So this year, we were not invited to apply under the digital delivery theme. I think it's safe to say that thanks, Donna. I see that you have to go. Nice that you could join us today. So I'm going to say of those 8 of the 10, I think pretty well everybody has probably applied for some more curriculum resource development. So in addition to the 200 resources that have been or are being developed in phase 1, there'll be some more coming out for phase 2. It won't be another 200, maybe another 100 or so. I don't know, because I don't know what will get funded, but more development work under these 3 themes, which is great news. Similar to last time, both Alpha Plus and Contact North were invited to apply under the digital delivery theme. It's very similar to last year's, to phase 1. And this slide is identical to the one that I showed you earlier, except that it says phase 2 instead of phase 1. So again, the 5 e-channel providers can get funding for resource development through Contact North's funding for this project. And Alpha Plus will again be involved in some development work and PD and training related to expanding and enhancing digital delivery. Okay, Nancy says, can you go to the last slide for 1 second? Sure, Nancy. That one? Okay. All right. You're very welcome. Okay, so we just did that one. All right, so then in phase 2, let's move on to what the regional literacy networks were invited to apply for. So they were again invited to apply for more of the community integration work under the same 4 themes: Better Jobs Ontario, apprenticeship, underrepresented groups, and workplace. I glossed over the workplace delivery piece a little bit when I was talking about phase 1. So let me just go back to that for a second, because the phase 2 work is a continuation of phase 1 for workplace delivery. The regional networks were funded to do something called organizational needs assessments with interested employers in their local area. So the organizational needs assessment are intended to help employers identify training needs for their employees. And then by extension, the regional network could suggest ways in which LBS could perhaps provide some of that workplace training if the LBS agency in that area was interested. So workplace delivery theme for the regional networks is a lot about organizational needs for employers in their area. And here's the new piece for phase 2. So service providers were invited to apply for service delivery pilots under 3 of the 5 Skills for Success themes: integration with Better Jobs Ontario, supporting underrepresented groups, and workplace delivery. So, as I mentioned earlier, some of you may be involved with the preparation of that application for phase 2 funding. Some of you may not have heard of it at all, which is totally fine as well. But a number of service delivery organizations, service providers for LBS did apply for service delivery pilots. So those again would take place sometime between April 1st of 23 and March 31st of 24. And currently the ministry is looking at the different applications through the business planning process to determine who would get funded for what in this phase 2. We don't have any information yet on that. And we're all madly trying to finish phase 1, those of us that are working on it. So what do the service delivery pilots look like? There were not a lot of requirements around the service delivery pilot applications, other than they had to relate to one of the 3 themes that were here on this slide. The service provider, the LBS service provider, was allowed to ask for funding to cover all of the costs of the service delivery pilot. So everything from staffing to technology to training supports, textbooks if they were needed, laptops, a whole thing. There was really no restriction on what one could ask for, except that service providers could not include curriculum development costs in their proposal or in their application. The total funding for a delivery pilot was limited only by the ministry's maximum cost per learner for that applicable cultural stream. I'll just spend a minute explaining what that one means. In LBS, we have 4 cultural streams: Anglophone, Francophone, Indigenous, and Deaf. And a few years ago, in the absence of a funding model for LBS, the ministry looked at the funding that was being provided to service providers and the number of learners served targets associated with that funding in all of the different cultural streams. And they came up with 2 things. One figure was the average cost per learner in a cultural stream, and the other was the maximum cost per learner for the cultural stream. I have concerns about those calculations, but they are what they are. In any case, the application to apply for the phase 2 Skills for Success funding had the one requirement around it that the total funding the service provider was asking for their Skills for Success service delivery pilot couldn't exceed the maximum cost per learner for their cultural stream. So for example, in the Anglophone stream, the maximum cost per learner is, I think, $2,500. So if I wanted to do a pilot project with 10 learners, then the maximum amount of money I could have asked for was 2,500 times 10, which is 25,000. If I wanted to ask for more than the maximum cost per learner, I would have had to provide a rationale as to why. So that's a really short version of what the requirements of the service delivery pilots were. The nice thing about them is that they were not too prescriptive. In other words, the ministry didn't put a lot of requirements around what could and couldn't be done. It just had to relate to one of those 3 themes. And they did put some restrictions on how much was likely to get funded based on that maximum cost per learner figure. And then just as we wrap up, I think this is probably the last or second last slide. In terms of what the ministry's priorities are related to the Skills for Success projects, what they have communicated to us as support organizations and regional networks is that part of what they're trying to do actually through, as well as the good work, obviously around apprenticeship and workplace and supporting Better Jobs Ontario and supporting underrepresented groups and supporting digital delivery, around all those themes, of course, that work is important. But they're also trying to use the costs associated with the phase 1 and 2 Skills for Success work to inform what we don't actually have right now. We don't have a funding model for LBS, and we never have. And they have said fairly openly at the ministry that they don't really know how much it costs to deliver LBS and to support it and to do program development work. So they're trying to get a handle on the costs, the real costs, through these projects. And Selmo, I see that you're leaving, so nice to see you today. Second thing, the ministry hugs back. The second thing the ministry is prioritizing, and some of us will cringe when we see this, is the full implementation of the LBS performance management framework. Some of you work with LBS performance measures every day, depending what your role is in your organization. So they are also looking at doing some further work with our performance management framework, but they haven't given us any detail on what that might look like. And then overall, kind of relates back to what I said a minute ago. They are trying to provide some renewal to LBS with this project funding from the federal government. We know as LBS providers that the LBS program has not received much attention at all in its 25 years of existence. So this is a nice, some would say that this is a nice thing to have this injection of money and funding into LBS right now. Others might disagree, but it is what it is. And the ministry has acquired this money from the federal government and is now providing it to our LBS field to do this Skills for Success work. So we're back to the beginning. This was the original agenda that I showed you at the beginning. We've taken some time to review the essential skills, the new Skills for Success framework, and our links between Skills for Success and OALCF. We talked about phase 1 of the Skills for Success funding related to resource development work by the support organizations and a little more community integration work from the regional literacy networks. Phase 2 is about those two things again, resource development and integration work, but also has the service delivery pilot operation or opportunities attached to it. So next steps will be for the ministry to determine who gets funded for phase 2 based on the applications they receive through the business planning process. The most immediate next step for those of us involved in phase 1 is to finish up our phase 1 work. So I will stop there and feel free to stay on and put some questions in the chat if you have any. Stacy will put the link back in the chat one more time for the evaluation. Certainly I can stay online a little bit for questions, but I do want to thank Rebecca and Carolyn, our ASL interpreters today. I would like to thank Deaf Literacy Initiative for providing the interpreters. Also like to thank COFA for their work upcoming in providing the French translation. And to Heather for acting as moderator and being there in the background today, and Stacy, who was our technical support. So thank you so much for coming. I hope you've gotten some new information and hope to see you at the next pop-up PD. And yes, have a great Family Day weekend coming up. I almost forgot about that. Ashley, the lead for the Better Jobs Ontario Community of Practice is Sarah Gill, Gill. And Sarah is the executive director of the Adult Basic Education Network in Hamilton. And you're very welcome. I see lots of nice comments in the chat. Lots of people indicating the information was helpful. So really, really glad that it was. You take care, Jerry Lou, as well. Always great to see familiar faces or not faces, but see familiar names when we do our pop-up PDs. Heather, you could probably stop the recording.